Camilla Olim, welcome onto the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
It's really good to have you. This is your first ever podcast.
It is, yeah.
And this is your first ever book.
It is.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
It's a great episode of firsts. Well, thanks so much for coming to join us. Now, your surname Olim, did you know in Latin means once upon a time?
I did know that.
Well, you are a storyteller, so
it's meant to be.
It's quite appropriate. This is the problem when you study Latin. You're always looking for ways to try and bring it into everyday life. It's not very often I get the opportunity. So we're going to talk about your book today. But before that, I think we first met probably 4 or 5 years ago. I think you were working Christian Concern at the time.
I think I just left Christian Concern. Yeah, it's about a year after that.
Okay. Okay, cool. And I think I came across you because you were online doing some blogs about abortion, and my overwhelming sense was, wow, there's like one other person, in the UK, it seemed, from my perspective, who's talking about this. Now, of course, there are more than that, but it can feel like that, can't it? It can feel like you're the only pro-lifer in the village. Was that your experience at the time? How have you found it, beginning to speak into this issue?
Certainly, yeah. So I started writing about it really because of, as you said, there weren't really any other people doing so. I wasn't hearing anyone talk about it. I'd only really come across it through Christian Concern and the organisations I met through them. So I thought someone needs to say something about this. So I thought I'll just start a blog and write about that. So I think I wrote one post, and very soon you were in touch. And it really felt like a God appointment, really, just to meet someone else who had the same heart. So that was very encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. I was encouraged to find someone speaking into the issue, and so eloquently and so helpfully. How did you find that at the time? What was the kind of response you got in those early days when you were blogging on this from people? You were putting this up on Facebook, weren't you, and other places like that? What happened?
Yes. So I think I underestimated how uncomfortable people would be with my talking about it. There were obviously some people who were supportive and were very encouraging, but for the most part I felt like there was a lot of silence surrounding it. So including, unfortunately, from the church I was attending at the time, it felt like, oh, she's gone there. It's not exactly a popular topic to discuss. So as time went on, I found it became increasingly uncomfortable as people really were a bit prickly about it, I think. Yeah. No, I'd
love to go on and talk about the silence in the church. So I think that's a huge phenomenon that we're up against. But I mean, do you think, from your perspective, has that changed over the years? I mean, compared to whatever it was 4 or 5 years ago, are more people speaking about it now, or where do you think we're at?
Do you know, it's hard to say. I can only speak from my own experience. I have never had a sermon preached on abortion in any of the churches that I've been to. Not at all. Wow. That's not to say they were all bad churches. I'm in a very good church at the moment, and I'm very grateful for that. But my experience has been that it's not a topic that's really spoken about, especially not at length. I don't know if there's a shift that's been happening. I know you've been doing some amazing work speaking to churches across the country. Perhaps the tide is beginning to turn in that respect. But certainly I've not seen that in the churches I've been at so far.
Yeah, interesting. And yet churches will often find voice, won't they, on other issues? So you'll hear, has your church, for example, those churches presumably spoke a bit about COVID-19, perhaps racism, I venture to...
Yeah, even difficult topics like trafficking, things like that, which are definitely worthy issues. And I'm very glad that churches are speaking out about these injustices. Homelessness as well is another big one, and poverty and unemployment, all the things that we should be standing up for. Those are all good things, but abortion seems to be the one that's kind of left on the side.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we're going to be talking about your book, but the sort of subtitle is confronting our social justice blind spot, and social justice there is kind of in inverted commas. I mean, were you trying to make a point there even in that? Talk to us about social justice and why is it we'll talk about some issues and not others?
Yeah, so I think social justice is a bit of a hot topic, isn't it? It's kind of a trendy word to use. It's something that many churches do like to jump on in order to demonstrate, that they are aware that we should be helping the community, whether that be the wider community or more locally. And I think that's a good thing. I think the example of Jesus shows us that we should be doing those things. I think the issue is where social justice becomes a bit of a virtue signalling event, and I'm not suggesting all churches are doing that. I want to make that clear, but I think there is a danger that we can fall into that. So what happens is we decide to speak on a certain issue because the world is doing that. So the culture around us is passionate about an issue that seems relevant at that particular time, and there are a few examples I can think of where that's happened, and immediately the church jumps on that bandwagon and will talk about it on their Sunday service. They will be demonstrating that they are doing something about that particular thing, almost as if to say, hey, look, world, we care about this too. And again, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. The issue, I think, is where we cherry pick issues at the expense of others that potentially are more serious.
That's right. Yeah, we pick and choose, don't we? And perhaps I won't mention names in this particular instance, but just yesterday I noticed a very well-known church leader was saying, with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, he said, look, let's not mince our words. Evil is evil. You know, and Paul doesn't mince his words. Evil is evil. And yet I know that same leader will not speak against abortion and call that evil. There's a real kind of double standard, isn't there, when it comes to this issue, and it just sticks out like a sore thumb, not just because of the severity of the issue, but the depth of our silence.
Absolutely.
Really. Well, let's talk about your book. I'm going to break the third wall here. Is it the fourth wall when you look at the camera? I don't know, but this is the book we're talking about today. This is For Those Being Crushed by Camilla Olim. It's a fantastic book. I had a privilege of reading some of the earlier drafts, but here is the final product, and it's available through Kingdom Publishers. Kingdom Publishers. You can find it on Amazon, I think Barnes & Noble, Waterstones, all the major retailers. Fantastic. And I just think this is one of the best books on abortion I've read, and certainly there's a real dearth, isn't there, in terms of books on abortion in the UK. We've got a few, some of them written in recent years, but really, you know, going hand in hand with the silence of the church, there's very little written, isn't there, on abortion in the UK.
Which is why I wrote it. I think at the time I just saw there was a massive gap in any resources on this subject, and I thought someone should really write a book about it, and then realised maybe I need to write a book about it. So.
Well, I'm glad you did. I think it's terrific. Now, one reason I love this book is it's very accessible. It's very easy to pick it up and to follow really a lot of your personal story. You share, don't you, about how you came to be convicted of this issue and God's heart on this issue, and step by step getting into meaningful pro-life work. So I think it's just so helpful for, as it were, the ordinary person. It's this isn't a book just for pastors or just for medics or anything like that. Who would you say it's for?
I think it's for any churchgoer, to be honest, whether they're a pastor, a church leader, youth leader, or anyone who's attending a church faithfully, I think, can pick up this book and get something out of it. And I would even say even people who are not necessarily following the Christian faith, I think even they could pick something out of it and find some value in it.
Absolutely. And I'll just read the commendation here from our friend J. John. The sacrifice through abortion of millions of unborn children, it is millions, isn't it? It's 10 million now in this country since 1967, is the scandal of our age. And it is shameful the way that so many Christians have been convinced to overlook it. This book, clear and challenging, passionate and persuasive, well researched and well written, should change our attitudes and actions. Please read this book, share it, and act on it. Now, that's a big claim there. It's the scandal of our age. What do you say to that? How could someone sort of justify that claim?
Well, I think firstly, just looking at the statistics, I mean, this is an enormous scale, almost hard to imagine. I mean, we're talking, how many people live in London now? It's about
probably 8 million, is it, or something like that?
9 million, maybe. This is more than the entire population of London that's been wiped out due to abortion. And I think the scandal comes from the fact that we've just let this happen over the past 50 years. Where are we on this? So why is no one saying this needs to stop immediately?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, current situation going on internationally, we're hearing a lot about Ukraine. Of course, it's horrific to hear of any civilians being harmed or killed in any way for any reason. But when a maternity hospital was struck recently, there was just universal outrage, and absolutely, a maternal hospital should never be struck. And yet, the very nations that are decrying this are themselves deliberately killing hundreds of babies every single day, and it's that, in a way, that's the greatest scandal, is not that it's happening, but the fact that we are so apathetic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Towards it. But what I also love about your book is it's not just a personal thing, but it's, you really, you start with God, don't you? You start with God's heart. And that sounds like an obvious thing to say, you know, we go with the Creator. But it's not, is it? You know, so many Christians even, we don't approach this issue with God at the centre, do we? I mean, how do you think most Christians have been approaching this, but if they ever do?
I think it really comes from a lack of biblical understanding. Maybe because people say, well, the Bible doesn't mention abortion specifically, therefore they're kind of free to form their own opinion. And I think in the absence of having very clear teaching, it's quite easy to just take up the secular view on abortion. And that seems to have been the case. And there was a study, I think it was 2011, from the Evangelical Alliance, and just showed the discrepancy between what the Bible actually says about human life and how we are to treat it, and the attitudes of many Bible-believing Christians on abortion. Was, I wouldn't say shocking necessarily, but certainly was concerning that we're so far away from biblical understanding simply because it's not taught. Yeah,
right. So yeah, there is this vacuum, I guess, isn't there, that's created by the lack of clear biblical teaching and understanding on this issue. And that brings us back into this issue of the silence, because you talk a lot about the silence, don't you, in your book? I think there's even a whole chapter sort of devoted to it. What happens if we don't speak? Can you tell us a little bit about that? You know, give us a taster of what you're getting at there. What does silence do? What effect does it have?
So I think people perhaps assume that if you are silent on an issue, you're just kind of saying, well, we're just neutral on it. But I don't think silence is neutral. I think silence does communicate an awful lot. So if you're not saying anything, you're kind of giving the impression, well, one of two things. So either that abortion is actually morally permissible, or that it's so bad that it can't be forgiven. And we know neither of those things are true. We know that the Bible is very clearly against abortion. We also know that Jesus is full of mercy, and every sin can be forgiven if you repent sincerely. So I believe both those things must be communicated in order for any kind of change to happen within the church and the wider community. But silence really just communicates the opposite, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the big sort of calls of your book, and your book is a call to action, really. That's how I read it. It's a very clear call to action. It's not just a sort of intellectual treatise, is it? It's not just seeking to understand, but I think, you know, mirroring your own story. It's saying, actually, this comes to each of us as a call to do something. And I think one of the calls you make is to churches to start speaking, isn't it, about abortion. But tell us more about your story, if you will. So were there some key moments, some key realizations that kind of moved you into being, as it were, actively pro-life? Because I guess you already were notionally against abortion some years before that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was very vague, to be honest. So I remember growing up, I did kind of believe abortion was wrong. I sort of dimly knew that was a Christian view. I knew that, you know, life is sacred and we must treat it so, but I didn't really understand anything about abortion. Never really been taught about it, not in school, not at university, and certainly not in church. So my views were just very vague. It was just sort of something that happened on the side. When I graduated from university, I started working at Christian Concern, as I said, and abortion was one of the topics that they cover quite frequently, and so I was very much exposed to it. I think it was in my second or third week, perhaps, a group of us went out and watched a presentation. In fact, I think it was from Greg Cunningham, who heads up CBR in the States, and we watched a live video of an abortion, a surgical abortion procedure. And of course I'd never seen anything like that before, and I think the visual impact of seeing what this looks like in reality really stuck with me, and that image would play on my mind for a very long time. So as time went on, you know, we were learning a lot about abortion and various other things. I just felt like God was really placing a burden on my heart to do something about it. I was looking around and I was saying, okay, this is a really, really terrible thing. I was 23 years old, I think, at the time, so I was still pretty fresh and excited, and over time I realised that actually no one else seemed to be feeling that excitement or that kind of burden, I think, for the unborn. And so, yeah, over time I think God just continued to place it on me, that feeling that I need to do something with what I've seen, with what I've learnt. So I started to write about it at work, and then I started getting involved with CBR, and I think from that it kind of developed.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm not sure I know anyone who is active in pro-life work who wasn't moved by seeing the pictures. Almost everyone I speak with, even those who don't use the pictures in their own work, that so often is a part of the story, isn't it? Because until we see it, I mean, how would you describe the difference? I mean, you've done it a bit already, but what new light does it bring to see abortion? Because you already knew you knew to some degree what abortion was. So what difference did it make to see it?
I think first of all, it makes you keenly aware that this is a human life. So once you see the hands, the feet of this tiny little infant, this is a child. And secondly, you see the violence that's been inflicted on this child. We don't see that in our society. It's all covered up, and I believe that's a huge part of why abortion is so prevalent, because it's behind closed doors. It's very much framed in language that makes it sound like another medical procedure. You know, it's no different than having your toenails cut. But when you actually see, even if you just see an image, I mean, I saw a video, but even just seeing images of what abortion is in reality, I think it really brings home the truth. This is a child, and this is violence. It's violent murder inflicted on that child. I know that's very strong language to use, and I'm aware that we must have compassion as well for many women who do not wish to go for this option, but I think we also have to remember who is the primary victim in the situation.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think when it comes to abortion, we get a lot of things the wrong way round, and we get our priorities all mixed up, and we forget who is the chief victim. Now, I think we can certainly say in many instances women are victims of abortion. They're secondary victims. Many of them are coerced, many are misinformed, many deeply regret what they've done, and of course, you know, whether they're conscious of that or not, we know that it's never good for a person to violate God's law. You know, so we can certainly see that that everyone who's been involved with abortion could also be described as a victim of deception, be that satanic or, you know, from the doctors as well, or whatever. But we forget the primary victim, don't we? And the abortion lobby's been very good at framing the narrative, and making it seem as though this is all about the woman. So can you talk to us a little bit about the language that kind of plays into this issue? You know, how has the abortion lobby set this up, and what do we need to do in response, actually, to reframe our own thinking, but also be an effective voice for the voiceless? And of course, your for those being crushed is that it's that Proverbs 31, verse 8. Yeah, it's picking up on that, being a voice for the voiceless, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, so I think language has played a huge part in how we view this issue as a society. It's been very cleverly done, to be honest, because even the word abortion is a little bit vague in terms of what's actually happening here. Yeah. And then you talk about women's rights, that was a big one, just the idea of reproductive choice and freedom and liberty. Of course, we don't think that's liberating at all, but these are the words that have been carefully selected by the abortion lobby. And then, of course, the way that the unborn child is framed, using words like fetus, which actually just means offspring in Latin, right? Or clump of cells, tissue, pregnancy. It's all very dehumanizing language, which is typical in any injustice. The first thing to be done is to dehumanize the victim. And once you've dehumanized the victim, it's very easy to justify your behaviour. So I think this is how we've ended up where we are. Of course, as believers, we know that the unborn is human from the moment of conception. The Bible speaks very clearly of that throughout. Psalm 139 being a prime example. And I think we need to rehumanize the unborn child. That's the first thing that we need to do. Of course, I also think we should be demonstrating compassion for the woman. I mean, we can't forget that is important as well. But I think we need to demonstrate that we're pro-life, as in pro-baby, also pro-woman, and stop brushing it under the carpet. This is a human life, and the child is the primary victim, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's helpful, and that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about teaching on this issue and books on this issue equally. I mean, if a Christian's going to read any book this year, probably it should be about abortion, because actually we don't even understand it rightly, let alone respond rightly. And all the information, so-called, we're getting is from the other side. It's from the mainstream media, it's the BBC, it's Hollywood. And so Christians are being brainwashed into a sort of so-called pro-choice, and even that term, obviously pro-choice, what does that mean?
Absolutely.
Basically nothing. So I think this is where books like yours are so helpful, because they retrain our minds to think aright on this issue. So I think it's ever so important that Christians learn to use the right language, and that's part of how we can bear witness effectively for those who, of course, cannot speak for themselves, and that's the thing that you pick up on, isn't it? So this is your first book. I've never written a book. I'm fascinated to hear a bit more about the process, but was there a part of writing this that was particularly difficult for you? What was the hardest thing about writing this book? Was it a certain section, or what was the biggest challenge for you?
I think all of it, to be honest, was a challenge in that there's a lot of responsibility in what you say. If you're writing a book, that means your words are basically permanent. So just making sure that, first of all, what I was saying was biblically accurate. I didn't want this book to be about my opinion. It's not about what I think about abortion. It's what is God's heart on abortion. That surely should be our first priority, which is why I started the book the way I did. So that was kind of a responsibility to make sure I was being scripturally accurate. And also, I think it was difficult to have to point out where we failed, and I'm part of that. We've all failed in terms of speaking out about this issue, but there is a certain level of discomfort when it comes to actually having to say, we've gone wrong somewhere. We need to turn back to the Lord and seek Him and repent.
I thought that was so helpful. That I think your second chapter, isn't it, confronting discomfort? I think it's so important that any treatment of abortion does confront the issue within the church, because it's not just an issue out there. Actually, there's an issue with how we're dealing or not dealing with the problem, and I think it's really helpful that you address that head on, because I think we can get people to agree intellectually about abortion, but then the silence still continues, and there's a reason for that. There's something. And how would you sort of describe that? What is that? What is it that holds us back? How is it that people could even have their theology straight? They could say, abortion's the intentional taking of innocent life. It's wrong. I would never have one myself, but they still do nothing. What's up with that?
I think there's probably many reasons for that. I think part of it is, as we were saying, it's that society has kind of brainwashed us into how we view it. Even if we know theologically that is wrong, I think if you're constantly being told by the abortion lobby or by the BBC or general society that it's a woman's choice and a medical procedure, then you've got these two ideologies battling away constantly in your mind, and so it becomes more and more difficult to stand with the truth. But I think a lot of it is also just being unsure about how to address it. I think that's a bit of an issue. I think many pastors probably don't know how to talk about this, for fear maybe that people will be upset in the congregation, because there will be women in their churches who have had an abortion, and knowing how to deal with that properly is important. So I think that's another reason, and to be honest, the biggest reason I believe is to do with fear of man, and we're all guilty of that. But I think we do tend to be more vocal on things we know that will not offend, which kind of comes back to what we were saying earlier about cherry picking on justice issues, because it's very easy to talk about homelessness, for example, knowing that everybody around you is going to agree. Your local community will congratulate you for doing something about homelessness, and we should be doing that. But in reality, if you speak about abortion, you're really putting your head above the parapet, aren't you? And you're exposing yourself to criticism. Maybe church pastors feel like people will leave their congregations. You know, there's many factors in that, but I think fear of man is a big one. Yeah,
no, thanks for sharing that. And I think, biblically, we see again and again the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is pure, and that's Old Testament. And even in the book of Acts, the fear of the Lord fell upon them, and indeed on the people around them. So no one even dared to join, and yet the Lord added to their number every day. So I think the fear of the Lord has been somewhat left by the wayside in contemporary British Christianity. You don't hear much about the fear of the Lord, and indeed I think we almost legitimise fear of man, don't we? I think we sometimes commend each other for doing things that get a good response from the culture around us. I think we've almost turned it into a methodology for church growth, isn't it? Let's make sure we don't offend anyone. So I've heard Christians encouraging each other in staying silent about issues like this. But how do you see that going down in for example, the New Testament? The way Jesus engaged culture, the way that the apostles, how did they consider the contentious issues of the day, do you think?
Well, I certainly don't see Jesus mincing his words. I don't see the Apostle Paul mincing his words either. Jesus was very outspoken against the Pharisees especially. He was not afraid to confront sin. His first command was always to repent, because ultimately that's what love is. It's pointing people back to the truth. It's pointing people to salvation. And I believe God will hold us accountable for not speaking on abortion, which is quite a serious thing when you think about it. But I think the pattern that we've adopted is very far away from the example you see in Scripture.
Yeah, so it's a real mix, isn't it? We've got heart issues of fear and I guess wanting to avoid persecution, but then we've got these sort of head issues of we don't understand the issue rightly, we're deceived. We've got these, you could call them hands issues. We're not sure what to do, we don't know how to do it. But if we go back to that second one, the head issue, I think one, and I'm really glad you addressed this in your book, because one thing that we hear all the time, so in our public education work, which I know you've been involved with as well, out on the streets, we're engaging members of the public, showing them the reality of abortion, asking them what they think. We had this just last week, in fact, in Norwich. One of the things we hear very frequently is, what you're going for makes no difference. If abortion was made illegal, there'd be just as many abortions as before. They'd just be more dangerous. So you're just simply going to endanger women. What you're doing is not going to achieve anything. And you address that, don't you, in your book? You have a whole chapter on that. So talk to us about that, because I personal confession, I was at least a year into full-time pro-life work, and I still basically believed that myth that changing the law wouldn't do anything good. So talk to us about that.
Well, I think we need to actually look at statistics. So I think a really good example of that would be in Northern Ireland. I think they actually did a study into how many lives, how many people were alive, basically, because up until that point, abortion had been illegal in Northern Ireland. I think it was about 100,000.
It was, 100,000.
I believe. So
amazing.
Just demonstrating that the law does protect people. That's what the law is there for. That's why we have a law that says do not murder. So that people aren't killed, right? So
and wasn't that upheld by the ASA, the Advertising Standards Agency?
Yes, so they did a billboard showing that this was this was true. 100,000 people are alive today because abortion was not legal up until recently.
And that's just Northern Ireland, a pretty small.
Just in Northern Ireland, and I think there were obviously some complaints, but yes, you're right, it was upheld by the ASA because it was actually factually correct. So I think we need to actually look at facts, not at the rhetoric that's being being spouted from the abortion lobby. And I'd also like to add, with regards to that the way that the abortion lobby has been pushing DIY abortions, basically, abortion at home through pills by post, which was introduced due to COVID a couple of years back and is still ongoing. You could argue that that's not very far from backstreet abortions anyway.
Yeah.
So again, I think it's just a case of reframing the narrative and not just accepting whatever phrasing has been thrown at you.
That's really helpful, because I think we Christians can be so on the back foot the whole time. We can be so apologetic and we just accept these claims that are made. Whereas actually, no, the onus is on the one making the claim to back it up. So where's your evidence? Show us where you've got these abortion statistics for, the level saying exactly the same when the law changes. Because we don't see that, do we? And in fact, even since you wrote your book, I think we've seen some laws change in the States, haven't we?
Yes.
Texas, Georgia, I think, if I'm not mistaken. We haven't seen a spike in backstreet abortions. There aren't women dying in the streets there. So it's a myth, isn't it? I mean, there's no other way to put it. It's a myth. There is no evidence for this claim, and yet it's made again and again and again. Yeah,
of course. And I mean, of course, we should still have compassion for women who are in situations where they do feel desperate. But I think rather than saying, oh, we should stop them from harming themselves in this way, shouldn't we be actually reaching out and saying, hey, we can help you with a better solution than killing your own child and endangering your own life that way. There must be a better way than that.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we have to see through what this accusation actually really is. And so many so-called arguments in favour of abortion, or access to abortion so-called, they're essentially slurs on pro-lifers. They're ad hominems, aren't they? They're trying to suggest we don't care about women, we don't care about babies, the whole, how many babies have you adopted sort of thing. Well, who's ever asking the abortion industry how many babies they're adopting? We need to stop accepting everything that's put at us.
That's right, It's quite a lazy argument, I think, and weirdly I seem to find it comes more from other believers than it does from the outside. At least that's been my experience. I seem to have had more attack from the Christian community because I only care about babies until they're born, and because I don't care about women, and I must be really lacking in compassion. Just all those kind of standard ad hominem attacks, and I think you're absolutely correct. I think we're too quick to just accept what we're told by the abortion lobby rather than investigating these claims for ourselves. And what do pro-lifers actually do to help babies? It turns out we're doing an awful lot.
That's right. Our friend Callum Miller has a terrific talk in which he goes through some of these objections. And in fact, I think this is one of the ones he gave at our conference a couple of years ago. And he actually drew up how many millions of dollars pro-life organisations and so on in the States have given year on year to support born babies and mothers, and it's incredible. And again, ask the abortion industry how much have you donated to newborns? Zero. Both here in the UK and in the US, the directors of CBR are involved in fostering and adoption. So it's a total myth. But of course, even if it were true, it wouldn't change the morality of is it okay to kill a baby?
It seems to be a way to divert from the issue at hand.
That's right. And isn't that what we're up against? We come back to that again and again.
Yes.
So many don't want to face this issue head on, whether it be other Christians who want to change the subject by focusing on other issues, or saying, well, hang on, what are you doing to help with some other issue? Or the abortion lobby themselves. They're constantly trying to change the subject. So how can we, what would be your message to people listening on this? And of course, we want them to read your book. But what can be next steps for Christians? How can we turn from silence to effective witness, to speaking out and really making a difference and helping to change the temperature?
So I think the first thing I would say would be to read the Bible, just understand what God's heart is for abortion. I think the first thing we need to understand is that God takes this very seriously. We see that throughout the Old Testament, the way that God views child sacrifice. I talk a bit about that in my book. Just understanding that this is very serious to the Lord, and really our priorities must be aligned with His. And so through that process of being transformed by His Spirit, through reading His Word, I think that puts us in a much better position to act. And I think every church can do something, every pastor can do one sermon on abortion, let's say once a year maybe. But going beyond that, I think practically there are many things that we could be doing, whether it's as simple as writing to an MP about an upcoming bill, to actually actively standing against abortion through public education, such as through CBR, or through helping crisis pregnancy centres. You know, I'm sure every church has a local pregnancy centre somewhere in their area that they could partner with, or they could help volunteer. You know, there's so many ways that we could be standing for the unborn.
Brilliant. And any particular hopes or prayers for this book? What would you like to see this book do for people, for the church?
I think I would like that it no longer becomes a blind spot, you know, because at the moment I think that's our biggest problem, is that it's very much not on our radar because it's not being talked about. I would like people to read this book and suddenly have an understanding of how important this is to God, how prevalent an issue it is in society, and how really we are commanded to speak out against, well, all injustice, but I think abortion is arguably the greatest injustice of our time. So I would like to see more engagement really with the issue, and hearts to be turned towards what God's priorities are, I believe.
Fantastic. So to see this issue brought out into the light, out of the blind spot, absolutely. And I think that's the call, isn't it? Ephesians 5:11. I think you quote there. You know, expose the deeds of darkness, that they need to be seen. The light of the gospel needs to be shone on this. So that's fantastic. What's your next book going to be on? Any plans?
I have no idea,
Nothing
to be honest. So I'm kind of taking a break at the moment, but we'll see. We'll see where God takes me, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be wonderful, wouldn't it, to see the church, by God's grace, shifted to such a degree that the next book about abortion is all about, you know, how we can be on the, you know, the nuts and bolts of front-footed, you know, changing public opinion. But,
and having some encouraging stories from
absolutely
things that people are doing. That would be amazing. I'd love to see that.
That's right. And, you know, testimonies of churches being actively pro-life, but we're just not there yet, are we?
Not yet.
We're having to break the silence, bring this out into the light. And thank you so much for your book, which helps us all to be part of that journey. And thanks for coming on to the show.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thank you.